everyone, welcome back to the Avocado Toast Budget. Today we are talking about emergency funds. Before we get into the video, please remember to hit that subscribe button down below if you enjoy learning how to save, invest, pay off debt, and feel confident with your money. So if you want to learn about emergency funds, if you need one, how much you need in one, and how to build one, just keep watching. Okay, so first things first, what is an emergency fund? So an emergency fund is a lump sum of money. Usually I recommend that you keep it in a high yield savings account that you are keeping there for, well, emergencies. I mean, it's pretty much exactly what the name sounds like, but it's important to keep in mind a few different things about emergency funds. The first thing is that you want to make sure that this money is liquid. This pretty much just means that it is very accessible so that you can grab it out and turn it into cash whenever you need it. This is why I recommend that you keep your emergency fund in a high yield savings account. I have my favorite high yield savings account linked down below. It's also important to keep in mind that this is truly for emergencies. So the goal whenever you are starting to budget is that you start budgeting for those things that they might be unexpected because you don't know when they're gonna happen, but you do know that eventually you're gonna have to pay for these things. Things like car maintenance or home repairs. You might not know exactly how much it's gonna be or when your car is gonna need new tires, but you know what's gonna happen eventually, so you wanna start saving for those. That way you don't have to dip into your emergency fund for things like that. Personally, I reserve my emergency fund for two main things: a job loss, because I'm never gonna see that coming most of the time, or extreme medical debt. There might be some other things that I just don't see along the way that my emergency fund can help me with, but ultimately I'm hoping that my budget is prepared as possible for those unforeseen but still foreseen expenses. So why do you need an emergency fund? I have tons of people ask me why I recommend that you set up an emergency fund before you start throwing extra money at your debt, and here is why. Your emergency fund is serving such an important purpose for future you. Yes, it might seem that you're losing out on money if you're keeping that money in a high yield savings account when it could be paying off debt that has really high interest rates, but the whole point of an emergency fund goes way beyond just the financial stuff. An emergency fund is there to protect you. You want to make sure that if something happens and you need cash fast in your hand, that you have that accessible and that you're not risking going back into debt that might even be higher interest than whatever debt you were paying off in the first place, or you're in a really bad situation where you can't take on any extra debt and you don't have the cash that you need. Life happens, and I am truly a believer that your budget is not all about money. It also needs to reflect your life, and an emergency fund is such a good example of this. So trust me, I know that feeling of wanting to take whatever is in your emergency fund and just finish paying off your debt or put a little bit more toward that credit card, but trust me, it is serving its purpose, hopefully one that you won't have to use, but one you're gonna be really thankful for, that if you do need to use it, it's there. So now that we've established what an emergency fund is and why you need one, how much do you need in an emergency fund? Now I'm gonna be straightforward with you. I am never one to tell you that you need blank amount of money in your emergency fund. Everyone's situation is so different that I would be doing you a disservice if I told you a specific amount. And honestly, I'm kind of wary of anyone who does try to give people a specific amount to put in their emergency fund. There are so many factors that are at play when it comes to deciding how much that you need in that cushion. So here are a few helpful tips to help you decide how much that you need in your emergency fund. The first thing that you need to do is decide your risk tolerance. Are you someone who likes to prepare for the worst case scenario? Or are you someone who's just kind of go with the flow? You're not too stressed about things, but you want to make sure that if something were to happen, you're covered in the future. These are questions that you can ask yourself to start to decide what your risk tolerance is. If you have a high risk tolerance, then you could, in theory, save less in your emergency fund. If you have a low risk tolerance, I would suggest saving more. The next thing that you want to do is identify your source of income. Are you someone who has multiple sources of income? All of them are pretty steady. One of them includes you being an essential employee and you get paid regularly and you know exactly how much you're going to get paid? Or currently, are you unemployed? Or do you rely on very little income? Are you the sole earner in your household? Are you a business owner or an independent contractor when you don't really know how much you're gonna get paid or when you're gonna get paid? Your answers to these questions can help you identify how much you need in your emergency fund and how much of a buffer that you might need if one of your jobs were to fall through. The next thing that you want to do is identify your expenses. The reality of it is that college students who are living in dorms and don't have tons of expenses probably don't need as much in an emergency fund as someone who is the single household earner for a large family or has a large number of people who are financially dependent on them. Most of the time, your emergency fund is there to cover the cost of living. So if your cost of living, even your bare bones cost of living, is higher, you're going to want to keep that in mind whenever you're building up your emergency fund. So now that we've kept that in mind, let me give you some jumping off points by telling you what other people online often recommend for an emergency fund. The first one that is very popular amongst Dave Ramsey's baby steps is a $1,000 starter emergency fund. This is where you just have $1,000 built up before you pay off your debt, then you worry about paying off your debt, and then the next step after that is building up more of an emergency fund. Generally speaking, I recommend that people have way more than $1,000 in an emergency fund. The reality of it is, even when you're in debt, you're at risk of needing that emergency fund. The same, if not more, than whenever you're out of debt. So having a heftier emergency fund based on all of the things that we've talked about, I believe is so important. The next one that is commonly tossed around in the personal finance space is 3 to 6 months of expenses. So when people talk about this, usually they are talking about 3 to 6 months of bare bone expenses. This means taking a look at your budget and deciding, what do I actually need to get by within the month? If I cut back all of the unnecessary things, if I was in a real state of crisis, how much money do I need to make sure that me and my family stay afloat? Sometimes people will take this number and then times it by 3 or 6 depending on their risk tolerance. Now with that being said, some people go with less and some people go with more. I also know people who have taken their full expenses, including all of the extra things that they enjoy, they times that by 3 to 6, and then that is their emergency fund. So really what I'm getting at here is, again, it is totally personal. If you're curious what I did, when I started budgeting, I had about 1.5 to 2 months of an emergency fund. This is what worked for me. My expenses are pretty low. My income is really stable. We're a 2-income household and we have no kids and relatively low expenses. So this number I figured could actually get me a lot longer than the 1.5 to 2 months. And thankfully, during my debt payoff journey, I didn't need this, but I am so thankful that it was there. Okay, so we've talked about what an emergency fund is, why you need one, and how much you might need in one. So how do you start building up your emergency fund? Step number 1 that I think is most important is to get on a budget. Get in a budget that works for you, works for your life, and works for your family. The reality of it is, it's really hard to save a large sum of money when you're not on a budget. Budgets allow you that freedom to start allocating your money towards your goals. And if your emergency fund is your priority, you can make sure that the majority of your money, or at least the majority of your extra money, is going towards that. I really recommend YNAB when it comes to budgets, and I will link a video up here walking you through exactly how to set it up. Now, there are some ways to kickstart your emergency fund, because I totally understand that trying to save that large chunk of money can seem really overwhelming, so there are some ways for you to get started. I think savings challenges are an awesome way for you to kickstart your emergency fund. There are tons of different savings challenges depending on your income, if you spend money on a card, or if you're an all cash spender. I'll leave a link down below in the description box for you to download my free printables, which have some savings challenges in there for you. I did one whenever I was trying to save up my emergency fund, and me and my partner are planning to do another one at the beginning of the year. Another awesome way for you to kickstart your emergency fund, if you have the means, is to pick up a side hustle or sell some things around the house that you aren't using anymore. When I first started to build my emergency fund, we started to sell things on Poshmark, and I actually made over $1,500 selling on Poshmark, just the things that we had around the house already. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, building up an emergency fund is not going to happen overnight. But once you establish how much you need in an emergency fund and start to brainstorm some ways that you can get there, whether that's making some extra money or cutting back on your expenses, having that cushion there is beyond worth it, and your future self, if something were to happen, is going to thank you for having that there. So that is it on emergency fund, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more, to make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below. Also, push that notification bell. That way you get notified every single time that I upload. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.